Thank you. It's a great pleasure, a great honor to be here tonight. I have a number of objections to the new atheism, but I don't think there's any more important to me than the idea of science being, in effect, diminished in public understanding and in public receptivity by the way that science is represented in this argument. New atheism is not new. It does have a very long heritage as a tradition of thought, which has been really declaring the project of science complete since at least the middle of the 19th century, finding the project to have been complete and to be authoritative long before anything that we would consider to be science had actually emerged. The polemical use of what is invoked as science over against anything, I think, is an abuse of science. I think that religion is abused by this polemical use of science. I think that also the condition, the stance in the world of the human mind is abused by it, because it tends very much to act as if questions were closed, which are open. It tends very much to act as if the resources of the mind were limited to what these particular writers consider to be rationalism, when the science that has certainly been produced in this century is really quite fantastical, and nothing that could ever be derived from the sort of 18th century knock-on model of reality that they generally present as scientific. So I think we live in a moment when science is as beautiful as it's ever been. I think we live in a time when we could, in an extraordinary degree, enjoy what it has meant to be human, which includes the fantastic success that we have had putting together a model of the universe and a model of profound reality, the reality, quantum reality, that can be arrived at by the brilliance of the human mind, despite the fact that it runs contrary to everything that we would take to be intuitively natural, believable, you know? It's quite beautiful. I read an article recently. It was one of those "why is there something rather than nothing" articles, which you normally expect to find philosophers dealing with. But in this case, it was an article about physicists dealing with it. And they had decided that although the universe ought to, in theory, generate matter and antimatter in symmetrical quantities, equal quantities, in fact, there is matter, you know, that does not simply collapse because it has an equal and equivalent presence of antimatter in the universe. So they described a meson, which fluctuates as things do at the quantum level between matter and antimatter states, but it lingers just a moment longer as matter than as antimatter. Therefore, here we are, you know. Now, I think a theistically minded person reading that thinks, that's really amazing. I think a scientist reading that thinks, that's really amazing. I think a new atheist thinks, well, we answered that question, you know. There are things, you know, I'm very much in love with the American philosopher William James, who lived at the turn of he was born in 1842 and lived into the early 20th century. And if you look at 19th century philosophy in America, he's the star figure, and if you look at 20th century philosophy in America, he's also the star figure. But in any case, he has a wonderfully open metaphysics. Perhaps he would not call it that, philosophy. in which he says that we know only what is presented to our ability to know, that anything is 1,000 times more complex than any perception that we can have of it. That what we're doing, he says that facts should be called, that the data should be called gifts rather than data, because of the arbitrariness with which we know what we do know. He has a very nice early anticipation of indeterminacy on precisely those grounds. He argues for a sort of democracy of ontology in which we concede the mystery of everything that we encounter. This at the same time that he's, of course, very much abreast of what was contemporary science in his moment and so on. He, on this grounds, he reintegrates human being into his conception of being itself. He says a thought is a thing. He assumes that you can reject a cosmology because it offends your moral sense, as well as because it offends your sense of causality or sequence, you know. In any case, he's pretty theistic, let's be truthful about it, but he does not insist on theism. His philosophy deals with these questions without imposing things that pre-exist particularly on them, insofar as that's possible. There are things that he talks about human intuition, like morality. He talks about the effect of thought on behavior, the effect of behavior on reality, all these things that see human beings as effectively interacting with reality. Now, and you know, this is what I absolutely miss in New Atheism and in the tradition from which it derives. It does not acknowledge the enormous efficacy and centrality of human consciousness. It pushes this very much to the side of these supposed issues. And at the same time, even, for example, in Stephen Hawking's latest book, the idea of the importance of the observer is everywhere conceded, you know? If the human mind is central to being insofar as we can know it, then how can you put aside the human mind as a central question and a central splendor, in effect, of the reality that we encounter? I think that there's been a great loss that has come from this, the claim of scientific authority for erasing away a central term in what everyone understands to be a contemporary and a necessary understanding of what reality is. If you look at a book like Hawkins, or you look at the books that come from people like Francis Collins on the other side of the issue, you can say exactly what William James said in 1890, that you can talk about the elegance of the cell, you can talk about the uncanniness of the atom, and you can say, on these grounds, there has to be a God, or on these grounds, clearly, no God is necessary. So if the same evidence persuades people on both sides, it's obviously not the crucial evidence, right? So if you erase that, if that's null, and the question is, what is the authority with which the rationalists speak, and how rational is their rationalism? What is the quality of the argument? What is the quality of the relevant evidence that they offer? Then it seems to me that that's where the disagreement has to be sorted out. I think that James gives a wonderful openness to the ways in which we can encounter these ideas. I think that there's nothing more human than the fact that this conversation continues to go on and on. I think there's nothing more sacred, if you'll allow the vocabulary, than the fact that these kinds of thoughts are profoundly meaningful to human beings and have been for as long as we have any human record. That, I think, is the sort of thing that has been excluded and cannot be excluded. And the erasing out of the great problem, which is the mystery of human brilliance, is the telltale inadequacy of what calls itself New Atheism. Thank you.
For most of my life, I've thought of myself as an atheist. Not the kind of easy atheist who has never been troubled by religious belief, because when I was around about 11 or 12, I was extremely pious, and it came to a head when I always liked doing woodwork. I actually made a little wooden cross to assist me in my prayers, the prayers I offered up for the salvation of my brother and my sister and my mother and father, who had, as I saw it, failed sufficiently to open their hearts to Jesus. And I've actually hadn't thought about this until I was thinking about tonight's event. And I'm quite interested in this, partly because almost as soon as I'd made this little wooden cross, I started to feel embarrassed about my religious belief. And maybe that embarrassment was unworthy, but there was a serious intellectual journey that I then made, which was reflecting that, if there is a God, then it's absurd to suppose that any advice I could give him is going to change his mind about what he ought to do. There was something about the scale, the difference of scale between how I, in my religious mode of thinking, how I had to think of myself and how I had to think of the Almighty, that made the idea of this interaction completely incredible. So and in a way, I still think that, although maybe if I went back to my 12-year-old self sympathetically, I would find that there was something intelligible that I was trying to do. But I think there really was something quite stupid about what I was trying to do when I was 12. So maybe I should stick to using the word atheist, but I'm not so sure about a new atheist. I think the reasons for not being a new atheist are brilliantly spelt out by Marilynne in her book. It was just a book of many wise. I mean, there's not a word in it that is not wise, but there's a word in it which I really liked and which seems to me which I feel is filling a gap in my own vocabulary, which is the word parascience. She didn't mention it in her own talk, but as I understand it, it's a very clever word because, parapsychology and all these things are really, everybody accepts, rather nutty disciplines or pseudo-disciplines. Parascience, as I understand it, or as I'm going to appropriate the word, whether I'm authorized by the author or not, consists of the sort of stories that scientists tell themselves to keep their morale going. It's like the songs they sing around the campfire about the rise of science and the great heroes of science, and about how the clouds of ignorance have been dispelled by the light of science. And the point about it, I think, as Marilynne brings this out very well, is that it's incredibly, dualistic, as though, you just had to tick the box science or the box ignorance, and there wasn't anything else in it. And it seems to me that Marilynne has done a very good job of dismantling what seems to me to be a very, very important part of the new atheism, that it's based on these stories that scientists like to tell, these self-glorifying stories. They play the role in science that nationalist myths play in nationalist politics, I think. So I'm an atheist, but I repudiate the parascience, that idea of science as something triumphant. And actually looking back at my own loss of faith, although I was a bit of a techie little boy, there was nothing to do with Darwin or Copernicus or anything that made me lose my faith. It was something to do with the actual religious experience that I'd had that started to seem to me to crumble. A number of other reasons for not being keen on new atheism. One is that if you know anything about Victorian crises of faith, you will know that there is really nothing that Dawkins and his friends say that isn't or wasn't already said by the German atheistic biologist Haeckel, or by Huxley, T.H. Huxley, or by Edward Aveling, the translator of Haeckel and a distressingly stupid but very militant atheist of the 1890s. The other thing that's worrying about the phrase New Atheism, is that it's actually a very old phrase. It starts to be used in the 1690s, where a French Jesuit writes a book called Le Nouvel Atheisme, which is about Spinoza. And that's very interesting, because Spinoza writes a book proving the existence of God. But people think that Spinoza's God isn't really the God, certainly not the God of Christianity, not the God of Judaism either, so that although he produces these mathematical proofs of the existence of God, maybe he's an atheist. So it's the new atheism. There's lots of other instances I've found in Victorian literature of people being called new atheists. I don't know if you know the unhappy relationship between James and Harriet Martineau. James kept his religion and Harriet didn't. And he referred to her as a new atheist in a sneery kind of way. She'd gone in for various kinds of rather sort of new age medicine as part of her retreat from Christianity. The other main use of, then new atheism is used about Haeckel and Huxley, about the Darwinist atheists, and then it's used again about Nietzsche, about the claim that Nietzsche and his famous claim that renouncing religion isn't enough, you've got to renounce morality as well. So it does seem to me that there's a huge range of different things that could be covered by the idea of atheism. And one of the worries that I have about new atheism and the debate that it's sparked off is that people tend to think that there's just one thing that's atheism. Can I give you a reading tip? There's a fabulous novel. You can get it in almost any second-hand bookshop. Maybe you've all read it, called Robert Elsmere by Mary Ward, Mrs. Humphrey Ward. Came out in 1888. And the hero, Robert Elsmere, is a Church of England vicar, deeply committed, very happily married to a very pious wife, and he starts reading German biblical criticism, and his faith is slowly eroded. And he puts his marriage on the line, he puts everything on the line. He decides he can no longer, in conscience, continue as a priest of the Church of England. And he leaves it in order to because he doesn't believe in the resurrection, lots of bits of doctrine that he says he can no longer believe in the sense that he feels the creed requires him to. So he goes off and becomes a social worker, in the 19th century sense of the phrase, a social worker in the East End of London. Still a pious man, but not unable to subscribe to what he would have to subscribe to in order to call himself a Christian. And I think that the journey that he makes is wonderfully described, and the pain that it costs him is wonderfully described. But there's also a moral that I think we can learn from it, which is that actually what Robert Elsmere finds himself believing that drove him out of the church is something which I would say is probably in the center of orthodoxy in the Church of England today. I mean, I think that there's nothing that Robert Elsmere believed when he believed he had to leave the church, which the Archbishop of Canterbury would not subscribe to and regard as part of Anglican orthodoxy. So I'm prepared to call myself an atheist, but only with great reservations, because it seems to me there are many, many varieties of atheism. William James's great book on this subject is called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And it seems to me we need to think also, and I think that's a wonderful title, because the idea that religion is not one thing is one of the great lessons that he has to teach us in that book. I think it's also worth thinking that there are many varieties of irreligious experience as well. And that there is also something which I think you might say this applies to the new atheists. There is also such a thing as varieties of religious inexperience. And I think that's something that we need to avoid. Thank you very much.
I suppose that insofar as I belong in this debate, it is as someone who has come late in life to some kind of reaffirmation of the sort of faith that Jonathan lost as a boy, which I also lost at the same time, and come by very devious paths, and paths which are strewn with doubt and disappointment. But nevertheless, came as a shock to me that atheism should suddenly become quite such a fashionable cause, and that distinguished intellectuals should write books advocating it without a sense that they were taking anything away from people. And I think this is the most remarkable feature of the Dawkins phenomenon, is that he and his colleagues have learned how to present atheism as a liberation. They say, we are setting you free. That's the only message that actually sells books in the millions. The Quran perhaps is the one exception to this. But I think that this idea that that you can be set free from religion is itself a very naive one, because it doesn't engage with that part of the human condition from which religion springs. And that's just what I want to say in the few minutes available to me. I think there are two aspects to religion, and it's unclear how they're connected. One is the aspect of belief. People believe in God. They believe in the validity of a certain message. They have a certain metaphysical picture of the world as a created thing rather than an accidental thing. This is a very powerful system of belief for which it is very hard to find any reasons, just as it is hard to find any reasons against it. But that's not the whole of religion. Far more important is the sense of membership. This was pointed out by the great sociologist Emil Durkheim, when people, who himself was a kind of atheist, in the very early days of sociology, people actually join a religion, or if they're born into it, they sense the pull of their community, which retains them within the fold of that religion during their life until they lose it. And losing it is an existential drama. It's not simply changing your mind, as Jonathan just said from the wonderful example of Ellesmere. This kind of joining, which makes religion so important to people's lives, brings with it a sense of the sacred, a sense that the world isn't just a collection of things, that the world embodies a kind of revelation within itself, so that there are moments, there are times, there are episodes, there are even objects and people who are bathed in a kind of light from another sphere, that there's a sense of sanctity which invades your experience as a result of your membership of the congregation. And this is something for which people yearn, which they miss, and indeed which they come back to late in their life. Jews in particular are very good at this, at spending their whole lives as atheists, but nevertheless retaining that sense of the sacred moment to which they come back in their final hours. We have been living through a time when the sense of the sacred has been disparaged. We're living, as another great sociologist Weber said, in a world which has become disenchanted. Worse than disenchanted, it's become desecrated, in the sense that those parts of human life, those episodes within human life from which our ancestors recuperated an idea of sacred things, have been dragged through the mud. I'm thinking in particular of the experience of sex, which for our ancestors was the primary revelation of the sacred in their lives, and also the sense of family, the sense of piety towards ancestors, and so on. All those things have been put on sale, and their aura has been cancelled. But nevertheless, we have to ask ourselves why it is that existed, that sense of the sacred and that desire to belong to a community which kept it in being. I think there is something deep in human nature that needs this, and that people need to see life as having that sacred aspect. Because without it, there isn't an answer to the question, why am I here? Why do I exist? Why are you here? And why am I in relation to you? If we are simply objects in a world of objects, then that sense of the meaning of our own life disappears. So I think that in the end, our sense of the sacred is connected with our recognition that we are not just objects in a world of objects. We are subjects in relation to each other, and that relation sets us in some way outside the natural order. And this is a revelation that we're granted in communities, and it's one reason why communities turn instinctively towards a concept of the transcendental. I'm not saying that it's easy to justify that concept, but it is very difficult to live a proper life without it. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. I'll just get proceedings going. Just a couple of questions before we come to the audience. We do have microphones which will go around, so you've just got to indicate and we'll come and find you. I suppose I'd like to start off by saying, just on the little tiny thing, we were talking about freedom. I mean, the point that Roger mentioned, the idea that somehow you sell books by telling people that this will free them from this or that. You know, I can remember going to interview Richard Dawkins and sort of sitting down and asking him to talk to me about his trip to America and asking him to show me some of the emails he'd received in relationship to that trip. There's no doubt about his bravery, about where he'd been. He'd gone and lectured on his chosen subject on his book at some of the evangelical colleges where a belief in Christ was an essential precondition for getting tenure on the staff of the place. And they were sent along to barrack him and to hassle him. And he talked about how afterwards so many people had come up to him and expressed their enormous relief at being able to suddenly declare that they no longer believed what they'd always been instructed to believe. And as I indicated originally, he perhaps, I can see a mismatch here, but he also wanted to talk about this as a sort of liberation for people. And we are all intellectuals here. We are talking about in a relatively rarefied intellectual way about the nature of religion, but for many people, wouldn't you agree that it can be a prison, a constriction upon thought, a constriction upon imagination, a way in which people are locked into ways of believing that are not their own and which render their lives considerably less fruitful than they might be if they could receive the type of emancipation that Dawkins promises? Would anyone like to comment on that?
I think it rather depends on the religion. If you look at the works of the imagination that we are familiar with, such as Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, or Bach's St. Matthew Passion, or Milton's Paradise Lost, there aren't, or Dante's Divine Comedy, there are not many achievements of the imagination which transcend those. But they would have been impossible without the framework of the Christian faith. You may say that there are forms of religion which stifle the imagination. I would say that is true, and that's a reason for rejecting those forms of religion.
I teach in a university, and we have a good many students who have come from China, and they have had a recent liberalization of their culture, and very many of them are looking for ways to understand the world in religious terms. They're looking at Christianity or Buddhism or, and they have found that to have religion excluded as a way of understanding the world is another entrapment. I think that, I'm a Calvinist, so I can say without blushing that human beings tend to entrap themselves, and they can take the most benign appearing phenomenon, the most apparently grand liberation, and make it into something that is a terrible constraint to them or a terrible constraint to other people. So the question, by becoming religious or by refusing religion, we have only made a decision in terms of how we will orient ourselves toward the world in order to be free. But neither choice can ever guarantee that we will be free.
I think there is such a thing as what Dawkins describes, namely people achieving liberation from beliefs that were, drummed into them as children, and suddenly realizing that it's not compulsory to believe what your parents thought you ought to believe can be a liberation. And I think that very often people think, you have to believe in something else, but I'm not sure about that. I think sometimes the real progress is from being in a state of mind where you think I must find something to believe in, to moving into a state of mind where you can be happy with the idea that there's nothing you're sure you can believe in. And what I worry about Dawkins is that he and his followers really do believe in something, namely they believe in science in this fantastically mythologized form. I once wrote a review a rather favorable review of one of Dawkins' science books, and I said it was a pity that he didn't have more sense of the variousness of the history of the scientific ideas that he was talking about. And I got this avalanche of things saying, you're just a bloody creationist. And which wasn't, because I'd said something that suggested there might be a slight gap in Dawkins's book, and it seems to me that the Dawkinsites aren't being liberated at all. They are part of a cult.
I just want to ask you just a couple more things that the relationship between science, rationalism, irrationalism, because the argument goes really from the Dawkins side that science is rational insofar as it depends upon evidence, it depends upon empirical findings, and therefore it can be counterposed to irrationalism, and irrationalism is a religion which doesn't depend upon that way of gathering evidence or confirming its beliefs. But I find that the ways in which these words like rationalism and science move around together is sometimes a confusing one. And if I could just ask you, Roger, about that, because you specifically in that little quotation I made talked about the way in which placing yourself at God's service is a leap over reason's edge. It doesn't make it irrational any more than falling in love is irrational. You're attempting to find a third term.
Yeah, I suppose I was really thinking in terms made familiar to philosophers by Kant, that there are limits to the human understanding. And one can think up to the edge of those limits, but one can't think to the other side. But nevertheless, that other side is constantly there for one, and it's there in your own experience. That's what I meant by referring to the fact that we exist as subjects and not just as objects. That there is something about ourselves that we can't put into words, and something about you that I can't put into words, even though that's the most important thing about you. So that our reason is constantly coming up against limits and stopping there. But we still have to make that leap. And that's not an irrational thing to do. That's why I wanted to compare this with falling in love, because that is just such a leap.
Marilynne?
Well, really, science has moved into areas where, the old classic notions of being able to test things and affirm them empirically is no longer something that science can answer to. Something that's interesting is the readiness with which these people use the idea of a multiverse, the idea that we're only one of in an infinite number of universes, and therefore all the things that are special about this universe that make life possible, etc., are simply statistically inevitable because there are so many universes, That's a very useful theory from their point of view, but it is absolutely untestable. And, they drop this standard the minute that there is something that they can refer to in legitimate science that is of use to their argument, and nevertheless operating completely beyond the reach of anything that even is theoretically able to be proved or disproved. And I love the idea of a multiverse. I'm perfectly happy with that, you know. Nevertheless, if they are going to say there is no mind because if you take a brain apart, you don't find a mind in it, you know, that's a very primitive notion of using a standard of evidence. If they, you know, I mean, and to go from that to saying, well, yes, we're just one of an infinite number of universes, this is not rational, I suppose, or, you know, you know, it's opportunistic reasoning rather than rationality.
Jonathan, could I say a word on the conflation of rationalism and science, and irrationalism?
Yeah, I think the question is, who are the true friends of science? I think many people think that to be a friend of science is to treat it as a single entity, a monolithic entity, well, that unfolds sort of inevitably through history, encompassing more and more information. And that just seems to me to be quite untrue. It's philosophically untenable and empirically untrue about the sciences develop in an incredibly haphazard and unpredictable kind of way. And indeed, one of the interesting things about Darwinism, one of the morals that William James, who was a Darwinist, drew from Darwinism, is that history is essentially unpredictable. That, you know, to use the phrase of later Darwinists, if you ran the evolution of species over again, it wouldn't necessarily produce the same results. He's saying the same about the history of knowledge. If you ran the history of knowledge different again, then it wouldn't necessarily end up in the same place. And it seems to me that the idea that there is one inevitable path which knowledge takes, and that's the knowledge, and that we are the beneficiaries of this inevitable development, is ridiculous. The other thing that I find objectionable about the Dawkinsism, which Laurie just paraphrased, is the reference to empirical information, as though empirical information, that's to say information derived from experience, was something that only natural scientists have access to. Well, I mean, I beg your, you know, as a jobbing historian, I am extremely concerned about empirical information about, you know, what people thought in the 17th century. And actually it was much more complex than these people who think they're empiricists, who think they're the friends of science, admit. So I think the true friends of science recognize that it is something multiple and complex, and they don't fall for the idea that there is just one single thing called science.
I have a last very quick question, then we'll turn to you. My last is in a way a sociological question. It was something that I mentioned in the early part of it. There's a certain strangeness, isn't there? We need an explanation, don't we, of why it is that at this particular historical moment, all these books have emerged simultaneously, had such a profound effect, sold so many millions of copies. So the glib answer is that it's simply a response to the threats of new religious fundamentalism, and that a number of people have woken up and said that everything that was said in the 19th century about clearing away religion failed. We've got to have a fresh onslaught on it in order to combat the new terrors of newfound fundamentalism. I wonder what your views are. How would you seek to explain not only the appearance of these, but their enormous success at the moment? Marilynne, have you got a view on the appetite for this?
Yes. Well, you know, I have read a good many of these books. I have been part of their sales success. And it's not because I subscribe to what they say, but because I'm interested in the controversy. And I know many people for whom this is true. So I think that, you know, the question of religion is something that's been central in the civilization for a long time, and it has been associated with war and all kinds of ghastly things besides. I think that certain personalities, Richard Dawkins especially, have kind of created the atmosphere of the controversy in this moment. But I don't think that, I mean, controversy is great. I think that we should only want more of it. On the other hand, I think that if it's going to perform the service for the civilization that it should, it has to answer to certain standards of rigor, which I think this controversy on both sides has not been particularly good at doing. On the other hand, I think part of what has happened is that religious communities have looked very squarely at an issue that has seemed on the peripheries of their awareness since the publication of The Origin of Species. And there's no harm in that. That's only a good thing. Where the fundamentalism comes from, you know, every once in a while fringe groups assert an inappropriate dominance in any movement. I think we're seeing that across the map right now.
Roger?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question. I have two thoughts in response to it. One is a positive thought about the new atheists. The Selfish Gene is a brilliant book, in my view, and it was the first attempt to present in straightforward language what evolutionary psychology tells us, you know, about species generally, and about how this would have impact on the individual life. And I think, so that was a genuine intellectual input that had have an influence throughout the culture. But sociologically, that's not enough to explain the phenomenon as you refer to it. And so the sociological thought that occurs to me is what Tocqueville said about revolutions. He said that revolutions promise to liberate people, but you can only ever liberate people from something that's dying. And I think that is exactly what has been happening in the face of religion.
Jonathan?
I think the 20th century was very much dominated, at least as far as Western intellectuals were concerned, by a story about modernization, it was partly a sociological story, in which superstition was going to be overcome by science and parochialism was going to be overcome by internationalism or globalization, and religion was just going to fall by the wayside. And I think, I guess that I probably rather assumed that most of my life. And I think it has been for kind of, and, you know, national liberation struggles were going to lead to prosperity for everybody. And all this optimism that one felt in the 60s and 70s, some of us didn't, I know, but I was foolish enough to feel that optimism. And it has turned out to be completely wrong. And I think that the explanation, I mean, why there was a need for and a thirst for the work of the new atheists was that actually it turned out that religion wasn't just curling up and dying, as so many of us had wrongly imagined it was going to do.